young people and drug use. So today's webinar is actually number 9 out of 10 webinars called Connect and Learn, and they're designed to support the AOD clinicians throughout regional and metropolitan Victoria, hosted by Turning Point and funded by the Department of Health and Human Services in Victoria. So my name is Sheridan and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. So before we continue, I do want to pause to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and would like to pay respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging, and acknowledging any Aboriginal people that are watching the webinar with us today. So this webinar uncovers the role of risk and adolescence, their drug use, and also presents ways to create opportunities for constructive risk-taking to reduce dangerous behaviours. So the objectives are around understanding why adolescents use drugs and how this relates to adolescent development, understanding other drivers of risk, how risk relates to resilience, and how to work constructively with risk, just to name a few points. So before we get started, just a reminder that the webinar will run for approximately 45 minutes. We really like them to be as interactive as we possibly can make them, so you will get an opportunity to ask questions. And when you do, you can just pop those questions into the chat box that's down the bottom left of your screen. And when you do, you can just pop those questions into the chat box that's down the bottom left of your screen. You can go ahead and do that at any point, and I'll be collecting those questions to be presenting them to our speaker today. And so do go ahead and do that. If you've got feedback or questions, you can pop them in there and I will collect them. There will also be an online poll, so please participate in that as well. And as I said, at the very end, there'll also be a Q&A, but pop those questions in as they occur to you. The other thing to know is that there's going to be a PDF version of this, should be sitting in your folder that's on the right-hand corner of your screen right now. So the slides that we will be presenting today are there as a PDF. And also there will be some research that we've got in PDF format as well that will be in that folder for you. So you can go ahead and download all of those. If you do have technical problems as well, Redback are here to support you. So, and there is also a number at the bottom of your screen as well. So if you needed to call them, but otherwise, if you're having a technical difficulty, you can pop that into the chat box as well, and they'll probably be able to see that and they can respond to you there as well. All right, so I'm really excited to present today's speaker, Geoff Bayldon, and would like to introduce Geoff to you all today for this webinar. Geoff Bayldon is a highly experienced youth worker. He's also a senior trainer and practice consultant. He's worked for YSAS for 16 years across many different programs, including outreach, day programs, drug withdrawal unit, and long-term residential rehabilitation. He's currently providing a training understanding methamphetamines across Victoria, to human service organisations, and it's a part of the beginning practice program at Child Protection. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Geoff to the webinar today, and thank him for his time. So thank you so much, Geoff.
Cheers. Hi folks, so we're going to talk about, as Sheridan mentioned, quite a few things. So we're going to probably have to start in the middle of a few different ideas today. We'll get through as much as possible, but I really want to let everyone know that if there's anything we talk about, anything I mentioned today, anything that seems interesting or you'd like to know more about, my email address, I believe, is up on one of the slides. Get in touch with me at YSAS. I'd love to continue the conversation. There's tons of other really interesting research and other bits that flesh out some of the concepts that build up what we're talking about today. But as I mentioned, we're sort of starting in the middle of a bunch of things. So some of the things that what we're talking about today rest on are the idea of functionality in youth drug and alcohol use, is that young people use drugs and alcohol to meet a need, to perform a function. What we'll be focusing on today is the function of risk-taking in adolescent drug use. But adolescent drug use meets a whole bunch of other needs, around identity, around managing difficult emotions, around a whole variety of other things. And some of the literature around that, there's some really interesting stuff by Anne Marsden and Michael Unger around resilience, which is sort of one of our orienting sort of ideas in youth AOD. And to just sort of briefly flag up the idea of resilience, resilience isn't just internal skills and abilities that people have. Resilience is also your social ecology. Resilience is the resources you have in your community and your environment. And a really big part of resilience for young people and building resilience isn't just having all of those skills and abilities and resources available to you. It's also sort of testing them. It's also operationalizing those sort of putting them under strain and seeing what happens when you experience adversity, when you're challenged, when you're sort of exposed to risks and dangers, and how you use those resources and how you use those assets to move through that. So I guess we'll talk a bit more about resilience potentially as we go through this, but these are some really important ideas that sort of underpin what we're talking about today. Okay, so what is risk? In a really simple sort of idea, risk is a product of the consequence and probability of a hazardous or dangerous event happening. But risk is a really slippery and large concept and very hard to kind of pin down. There's lots of different ways of understanding risk. That's sort of the most commonly understood definition, but we'll be talking a bit about today the idea that young people's risk taking can be seen as a bit of a gamble. It's an attempt to gain resources or gain experience or gain a learning at the sort of potential risk or putting at stake certain other things, physical safety, legal status, and a variety of other things. We'll get a bit more into detail around that stuff. But I think the idea of risk, as it's commonly understood, is much more in sort of the OH&S sort of health and safety kind of concept, and more of the hazard. We won't be talking so much about hazards, as in falling in a manhole type risk. We'll be talking about young people trying weird and wonderful things. So these are some of the areas we're going to look at in understanding adolescence. I think the first task we need to get through today in the brief time we have together is understanding adolescence. So there's a few different ways of sort of approaching the idea of understanding what adolescence is about. But essentially, it's a period between childhood and adulthood where young people are developing and learning and building a whole bunch of skills and abilities and talents and attributes for the adult life, for their sort of ongoing existence. So there's a whole bunch of things that young people do. They're sort of tasks, what we term tasks of adolescence. And these tasks, will seem probably pretty self-explanatory to a lot of people who are watching. The idea of achieving independence from parents and other adults, so individuation, developing a realistic, stable, positive self-identity, forming a sexual identity. These are sort of some of the things that adolescents do, and intrinsic in trying new things, in learning and growing, in developing and sort of experiencing this sort of stuff is the inherent risk. So risk is something, if you try something new, try something you've never done before, it's going to be much more risky than something you're quite good at. For example, if you're a professional chainsaw juggler and you've been juggling chainsaws for 20 years, there's obviously a little bit of danger there, but it's much more challenging and dangerous if you're just to pick it up today and have a crack at it. So adolescents are in this space of having a whole bunch of new opportunities, a whole bunch of new avenues to pursue, and not having much skill and much practice, much experience in those spaces. So they make them much more inherently much more dangerous. So when we're thinking about the idea of developing independence from adolescence, or individuating, a big part of individuating is setting up a separate identity. Say, how do you say, I'm not part of this family unit, I am my own individual person, I am my own separate person? And a big part of that is about pushing against what is seen as the sort of vestiges or the sort of trappings of the family. So and authority figures. So things like drug and alcohol use, things like smoking cannabis with your friends. It's a really good way of doing something that adults and authority figures don't do. So it's a good way of, you do something that is in opposition to or different to, is a good way of setting up individuation and separation. If you think about identity formation, so this is a really important task of adolescence. When you're looking at how you might fit in, how you might understand your identity, how you might try on different sort of hats or masks, as it were. The idea of, for a lot of young people we work with at YSAS, they have, come from backgrounds of deficit and poverty and marginalisation, and the kind of opportunities and options to try on different identities are pretty limited. We do a lot of work in the out-of-home care space, and we see a lot of young people who their sort of the identity that they move towards is that of the lad. I don't know if anyone's come across lads in your travels, the Nike TNs, Dry Fit, Ralph Lauren Polo, bum bag. How sick is Cursor? Oh, Cursor's the sickest, bros. That sort of identity, which I think is a really safe identity for a lot of young people in out-of-home care. It's it's really sort of well accepted and celebrated by your peers. It speaks to a sense that you are someone to be maybe feared or at least respected. And at the core of that identity is either smoking a lot of methamphetamine or talking a lot of rubbish about how much methamphetamine you smoke. So drug use in terms of identity formation for a lot of young people, especially in these sort of marginalised spaces, talking about crime, offending, talking about drug use, engaging in drug use is a really sort of safe and I guess well accepted and celebrated identity for peers. And I guess we're thinking about, obviously these tasks of adolescence, like I say, all of them have risks. You think about forming a sexual identity, that has a whole bunch of inherent risks in terms of unwanted pregnancies, STIs. So we can see that this process of adolescence, these moving through these tasks of adolescence is fraught with a lot of inherent risk. So we'll talk a little bit about adolescent neurobiology. And for anyone who is a neuropsych or a neurobiology major, I apologize for this. This is a simplified version of some of the important ideas in adolescent neurobiology. And I guess the important thing for us to think about in terms of the adolescent brain is that adolescence is a mammalian trait. This is not something humans go through. All adolescents go through this process. All mammals go through this process, sorry. And what essentially happens is that in puberty, the limbic system, which is responsible for emotion, risk and reward, and a bunch of other things, is heightened and is really sort of sensitized and heightened to novelty and sensation seeking. And amongst, like I say, massive oversimplification, amongst a bunch of other things. And the point of that is so that adolescent mammals sort of driven to try new things, to experiment, to seek out novel and exciting activities, to leave the nest. If this sort of limbic sensitization, if this reward-seeking, sensation-seeking, and novelty, risk, all release dopamine. Dopamine is important in reward. The mesolimbic pathway is the part of the brain that's sort of implicated in the reward process. So that mesolimbic pathway in adolescence, dopamine levels drop, endogenous dopamine levels drop, and the amount of dopamine receptors increase. So adolescents will find that you're hitting away. So boy, this is rubbish. I'm bored. It's boring. Adolescents are more bored, and this is a really useful mechanism. If adolescents are more bored, they have itchy feet. They want to go out and try new things. They want to have sort of a wanderlust. They want to go out and explore. And then when they do things that are novel and exciting and risky, like leave the nest, leave the family home, go and compete with older, scarier males and females for sexual partners, and sort of start their own clan or tribe. These things are much more rewarding. So this is a really useful mechanism, because otherwise you would be stuck at home. Kids would never leave the nest, and which I guess is happening more and more these days. But I digress. So we'd have much less, much less of this sort of young people getting out, individuating, becoming their own people, and spreading to every part of the globe as we have. There's some really, really interesting and useful, if anyone's particularly interested in this sort of stuff, check out Dan Siegel and Lawrence Steinberg. They do some great stuff. Dan Siegel talks about the essence of adolescence, which is emotional spark, which is the limbic system activation, social engagement, which is the importance of peers, a real drive for novelty and risk, which is what I just mentioned, and creative endeavour, which is sort of wanting to question, wanting to push boundaries, wanting to sort of challenge the status quo, which are all really important, useful, beneficial things in the adolescent animal, in adolescent mammals, but they are the kind of things that send all of us who are supporting adolescents, who are working with them, great. So, like I say, if you want some more information, I'd highly recommend Dan Siegel's work around that stuff. But I guess the other thing about adolescence is that there's a lot of discussion around the heightened activity of the limbic system. But the prefrontal cortex, which is by a lot of definitions, the cortical part of the limbic system is still being developed. It's still being sort of fully sort of functioning through, and the limbic system, so the prefrontal cortex is developed through experience. So you learn things like emotional regulation, you learn things like impulse control, you learn things like distress tolerance. These aren't things that you're sort of born with. So what we have is a mismatch in adolescence, in the first instance of adolescence being much more interested in all of the things I've just mentioned, really keen to pursue dopamine, to pursue excitement, novelty, risk-taking, really keyed into the sort of peer environment, but maybe not having a fully well-developed prefrontal cortex. So their decision-making can be a bit hampered. Another, I guess, really important thing in sort of that essence of adolescence, Dan Siegel idea, is the idea of social engagement. That adolescents are really, really profoundly keyed into how they connect with their peers. And this is something that, I guess, as adults, it's really important in all of this sort of discussion around adolescence, is that as adults, we don't think the same way as young people. So to think about a young person's drug use or risk-taking, go, well, I wouldn't do that. Of course you wouldn't. You're in your 30s and you're a lovely, wonderful, fully mature, developed human being. You don't have the same brain functioning as an adolescent. But adolescents are so keyed into peer engagement in this really profound way, because it is a basic survival mechanism. As I said, the sensation-seeking, novelty, you're out of the nest, you're trying new things, you're doing dangerous stuff out there in the wild, and you're growing and you're developing and you're preparing for your own family and future. If you are by yourself, if you are alone, you get eaten by things. If you have a bunch of peers that are accepting you, that are part of you're part of a tribe, a gang, a posse, then what you have is safety in numbers. It's much less likely that you get mauled to death by things. So for adolescents, this idea of what the peers are doing, what friends are doing, is vitally important. And this drive to be part of that peer group can sometimes be a big pull for people's engagement in drug and alcohol use. And depending on where young people see their identity and understand where they've come from, the peers that they're drawn to might not necessarily be the sort of the local after-school youth group. They might be young people who have a much more similar lived experience to them. So young people from trauma background, young people in residential care, young people in youth justice. So they're kind of the peers that they're going to be drawn to. They have much more in common. And being drawn to those peers, as I mentioned, is profoundly rewarding, and it's profoundly important for survival from a historical perspective. So one of the other things to think about is impulsivity. And the young impulsivity, as I mentioned, is a prefrontal cortex function, and impulsivity is something that is developed and built, and a skill that's developed over time. And it's one of the most important skills for us to support young people to develop. And there's been a bunch of studies that I've been looking at where young people who have poorer impulse control earlier on tend to have much more profound and problematic risk-taking than young people. All young people take risks. All young people do silly things. All crime increases and drops in adolescence. Self-injury increases and drops in adolescence. Substance use increases and drops in adolescence. Into the early 20s. So young people who have greater impulsivity have much more issues with more profound, more risky, more dangerous, more problematic risk-taking. So I think we're going to do a quick little poll or a survey. So what I'm going to ask you, lovely folks, is what do you think is the leading cause or biggest cause of adolescent risk-taking? So we'll just have a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds of have a click, see what you think, tell me what your opinion is. Well, this is so we've got some love for young people driven by the reward system. Young people don't have cognitive skills yet to determine the consequences. They're not able to think through and solve problems like adults. Not much love for young people who don't know it's dangerous. Probably a lot of people watching potentially that have done education in schools ad nauseum and have told young people a lot of things about dangers and risks. Awesome. So we might stop the poll now if that's some good feedback. So excellent. So we have a win for they are highly driven by the reward system in their brain. As sort of a simplification, absolutely. There is. I want to figure out how I click onto the next slide. Can I just click?
Yeah.
Yep.
That's it.
Awesome. So I guess some of the myths we have around adolescent risk-taking are that young people don't know that the risks and dangers that they're taking, are unaware of I'd hazard to, I'd imagine that there's not too many young people out there who would say, cigarette smoking, meth, I had not heard a bad thing about them. They sounded amazing. There's no, no one's mentioned it at school, nothing on TV, nothing in the, social media. It's, so the idea that young people are unaware is a bit of a furphy. So the idea of the personal fable, or the idea that young people think they're invincible, is true, but it's also true of adults, and adults think that they're more invincible. By and large, people think that they are more capable than the average and more likely than the average to survive things, so that personal fable exists for everyone. That young people don't think about the consequences, that young people don't think through the sort of outcomes of their actions, that if you do something silly, you don't think about the downside, is it's not true, but adolescents have what Dan Siegel talks about as hyper-rational thinking, which is young people will see the benefits, the potential dopamine, the potential reward, the potential upside, and they will absolutely they'll focus much more strongly on that than any potential consequences. So they typically know about the consequences, they just don't tend to be driven by that. And there's some really interesting ideas around for young people being really keyed into potential rewards, being not so put off by consequences, being quite a useful way of going about sort of decision making, especially when you think about business, think about sort of internet startups, think about new companies, think about like Apple, for example, when they made the first iPhone. At some point, that was a ridiculously silly idea and dangerous, and the consequences are it could cost the company millions, but they took a punt on that. So the idea of being sort of reward sensitive can be very beneficial, can be very motivating, and move people in really positive directions. And they're not able to think and problem solve like adults. So there's a bloke called Lawrence Steinberg who does a lot of research into adolescent culpability, as in youth justice-y kind of things. And he does numerous psychological experiments with young people and surveys and such. And from the age of about 15 onwards, young people are just as good as adults to be able to make decisions, to be able to problem solve, to be able to think through their actions. So their cognitive processes are just as strong as adults from about 15 onwards. The other thing I wanted to mention, just briefly, I'm imagining quite a few people have come across the idea of ACEs, or the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. So we know that young people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences tend to have issues with emotional regulation and impulse control. And ACEs are strongly correlated with increased risk-taking and substance use. So that can be another big vulnerability for young people when they've come from those sort of backgrounds. And again, part of that sort of impulse control, emotional regulation stuff, if you're not able to control that as well, you're more likely to think about substance use. If your friends are doing something, you've got school tomorrow, you've got something else going on, your friends are saying, hey, let's go for bongs. The idea of going, well, no, I'm going to put off this short-term reward because of the long-term benefits I might get down the track are much harder to do when you have poor impulse control. So I think this idea of hot and cold cognition is really interesting, and for a lot of reasons. I think this idea that the adolescents are as good as adults at making decisions is absolutely true from about 15 onwards. They're just as good at thinking through decisions, problem solving, assessing good and bad, and this, what we might call cold cognition, in the lab, on paper, being able to think things through, being able to weigh out the pros and cons, being able to figure out what the possible dangers and risks are. Young people are just as good as that as adults. But what happens is when the reward system's fired up, when dopamine's on offer, whether it's your friends are out the front and there's a social reward on offer, whether you've used substances and there's already dopamine in your system being released by substances, the idea of hot cognition, as in doing it out in the real world when there is potential reward on offer, young people are not particularly good at it. So it means that young people's decision making, there's certain things young people are going to be just as good at. So potentially a young person at 16 is just as there's certain things young people are going to be just as good at. So potentially a young person at 16 is just as capable to vote as a young person at 22. A young person at 16 is going to have a much harder time deciding whether or not to get into the stolen car with their cool mates than a 30-year-old. So does that make sense? Hopefully. The idea of an excitable situation, the idea of dopamine or reward being on offer, makes young people incredibly susceptible to that. So we have a lot of things we don't let young people do through this sort of idea of immaturity, like they're not mature enough to make these decisions, which is a really sort of disempowering narrative that, you know, you're immature, you're silly, you haven't quite figured out, your brain doesn't really work yet. We can absolutely have a bit of a, you know, sort of dismiss that and have a think about how we can better allow young people to make decisions, especially if we set the context for decision making in, you know, that isn't heightened. And I've had a lot of YJ workers sort of bemoan the young person who has, you know, in session absolutely wholeheartedly, passionately agreed that their you know, car theft days are behind. They want to make changes, and they genuinely do. And the workers told them, they're like, "Yep, awesome, you've made some great plans, wonderful." The young person is wholeheartedly, passionately committed to not getting in stolen cars with their friends. They walk out the front of the YJ office, their mate to pull up in a stolen car, and within a second they're in there. That's a good example of heightened cognition. So, you know, in the session with a YJ worker, absolutely they can see the pros and cons. They wanted to make changes. They can see the downside of that. But when that's heightened, when that sort of, you know, the reward is there, much, much harder to make that decision. And there's, I guess, there's another idea. Like I say, there's lots of things that we could talk about much more here. We've got a very short period of time, but there's an idea in economics of rational self-interest, in that people act in rational self-interest. You think things through, you weigh out pros and cons. Rational self-interest is a bit of a furphy. So young people's decision-making is coloured by a variety of different things and not necessarily rational in any way. So again, making sure that when we're seeing young people's behaviour, young people's substance use, young people's risk-taking, that we are trying to see that through the lens of adolescence, which we've just discussed, rather than through our own adult experience. I think that's a just really important reminder, again, just to reiterate that you can remember what you did when you were 16, but you can never think like you did when you were 16. Again, young people's understanding of this, like I said, there's this idea of rational self-interest. That's not how young people work. Young people's decision-making, young people's, whether they choose to use substances, pinch cars, do other sorts of risk-taking activities, is very much driven by a variety of different individual factors. And I think the idea, going back to the idea I mentioned at the start, the idea of a gamble. So young people taking a gamble when they take a risk, whether that gamble is for identity, as in this is an activity I'm going to do, I'm going to be smoking cones, you know, I'm going to go and smoke some weed because this reinforces the idea of, you know, I'm part of a subculture, we are not part of the mainstream, it's 420, you know, I've got a wallet with a mull leaf on it, you know, like I know all of the facts about cannabis, this is part of my identity. Whether they're taking that sort of risk of using cannabis to, you know, to support that identity. The idea of, you know, the possible downsides of that choice are things like maybe, you know, not having, there may be some legal ramifications which the young person might not sort of consider as important. So the things that that kind of underpin how people weigh up that risk-reward balance, you know, people's beliefs, people's values, people's worldview, people's self-concept, people's schemas, the way they understand the world. One sort of an example of a young person that I worked with a number of years ago, who was regularly stealing cars, getting in stolen cars with friends, and for this young person, he would weigh up the risk of getting a stolen car. So the risk for him was potentially, the gamble was that he could die. So there's a physical safety element to the risk he was taking. There's a legal risk to this. You get done by the cops and go to Parkville. There's you know, a family risk because he's potentially a relational risk that his parents are getting pretty jack of this behaviour. But he was gambling those positive and negative outcomes against the positive outcomes of peer acceptance, of belonging, and of peer status and identity. And for this young person, those possible positive outcomes of peer acceptance and belonging were profoundly important because this young person was incredibly isolated, marginalised, didn't have many friends, didn't connect with anyone, didn't belong, didn't have any other friend, any other ways of meeting those needs. So peer acceptance, when you don't have any of it anywhere else, becomes profoundly important. So if you're out of school, you're out of social clubs, out of sporting clubs, then these sort of these needs become much more important. So I hope that makes sense. And I guess for him, the idea of physical safety, the things he might lose, the downside, the deficits, physical safety for this young person was less important. Well, de-emphasised, potentially because of a long history of family violence and dad wailing on him and beating the hell out of him, and some of his schemas and core beliefs that he was pretty worthless and a bit of a nothing human, and that he didn't deserve to be happy, and that he was a bit of a rat, sort of a rubbish. So this idea, this schema, I'm nothing, I'm worthless, I don't deserve anything, meant that physical pain, legal issues were things that weren't sort of profoundly important to him. So hopefully that makes sense, the idea of the gamble. Just want to quickly flag up the idea of acuity of risk. So this idea of acuity, I think sometimes gets lost, and we think that that we kind of focus on these acute risks. So for a young person who's using heroin and they go to secure welfare, they go to Parkville, they go to detox or rehab, and for that young person, they might leave in a bad mood after having a blow up. They might have missed the talk about lowered tolerance, and they had a pretty heavy heroin habit beforehand. So they've gone out there, and we're really worried that they're going to go and use something similar to their previous amount of the drug and overdose. That's an acute risk, and we're right to worry about that. There's a whole bunch of that young person's gambling their safety and well-being against reprieve from these difficult emotional thoughts. Just to go back to our previous idea. But I think we really miss out on.
It's brilliant, by the way. It's really good.
Oh, cheers. Sorry about that, folks. I think I broke the mic thing by speaking quickly and moving around too much. I'll try and avoid that. So I was just mentioning that we, in our concern about acute risk, sometimes we miss out on some of the other ones. And I think a cumulative risk that I think is really important to think about is for young people who are engaging in cannabis use. Quite often we get sort of a bit sort of lackadaisical or a bit sort of unconcerned about people's cannabis risk because it's kind of pretty pedestrian, it's pretty common. But the idea of people engaging in cannabis use to the exclusion of education, to the exclusion of social inclusion, to the exclusion of a bunch of other activities and engagement with social settings and family and a variety of other things is a really serious cumulative harm. So over time, that can be much more of a risk and a problem than potentially some of these things that sort of more red flag big ticket items. So this, I think, is this idea of risk perception is a really important thing to think about. So when we're looking at young people's risk taking, when we're looking at young people's substance use, whether they're using methamphetamine and absconding and disappearing off with dodgy people at all hours of the night, the idea of how we understand that risk is driven by these sort of ideas of familiarity. Do we have is it a risk we're regularly seeing? Is it a risk or an issue that we've seen? So recency, is it something that we've seen just the other day? And I think that's where we can be sort of a bit I can't remember the word I'm looking for, but a bit inappropriately unconcerned about people's risk in the drug and alcohol space. We, cannabis use, going, it's just a bit of cannabis use. If we see that all of the time, we can become sort of desensitized to that risk. Personal control is a really important thing about risk taking. So if you feel like you are flying the plane as opposed to in the back, people feel much more in control when they're driving the car, whether they're a passenger in the car. Regardless, neither of those things make a difference on whether you're likely to die in a car accident. People having agency and control over the risk makes a big difference. Policy content, organisational content. So, I work for a health service. We have a different sort of policy and organisational context to DHHS, child protection. They have the Herald Sun test, we don't. So whether it's a voluntary or involuntary risk, do you get to choose you had the risk, or was the risk sort of foisted upon you? And dreaded outcome, I think, is a really important idea. So things like terrorism is an incredibly unlikely risk. No one dies of terrorism. It doesn't really happen. It's not really a thing. But the idea of a dreaded outcome means that you've been ruminating and stressing about it and kind of marinating in the anxiety of this risk. You've been preloaded for this risk. So people's perception of the risk of terrorism, the likelihood of it happening and the severity of it happening is much higher than it should be. So a lot of these ideas around how people sort of assess risks and perceive risk, there's a lot of different, I think we have this idea that we're really objective and empirical and make these great decisions based on data and stats. That's not the case. And the thing that's really regularly forgotten is the idea of the benefit of the risk. What people get out of this? What's the upside of this risk? There's got, risk has conveys some really useful things. Risk is learning. Risk is a new thing that you're trying. So where am I up to? Acceptable risk. So what is an acceptable risk? An acceptable level of risk depends on a variety of different things, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in here around duty of care, what a reasonable person would do, but what kind of risk we can support, what kind of risk we can promote, and just other thing wasn't mentioned at the start. My background, as well as AOD, is in adventure-based therapy, so I'm a massive fan of risk, as you can probably tell. But understanding what risk we can promote and support varies on our role, our worker role, our organisational resources and context, the young person's vulnerability. So there's this idea, I'm sure people have heard of the idea of dignity of risk, and dignity of risk is often used in the context of aged care and disability care, that we should let them take some risks. But if they don't have capacity to consent, they don't have capacity to think it through, then we need to kind of protect them. And that idea is kind of extended to young people, that young people are foolish and stupid and can't think through things, which is what we just busted a moment ago. So therefore, we need to protect them from risk. Young people are totally capable of planning and thinking about how they manage risks. If a young person wanted to go horse riding and you did some planning around that in a cold cognition context, they could do some really good planning. But it's very much driven by a variety of different things. The schemas, beliefs. The other thing we often forget is that risk isn't just physical risk. It's not just death. It's not just car accidents. Risk is relational risk, emotional risk, legal risk, reputational risk. And this is really problematic when we think about not letting young people go horse riding because they might fall off and break their arm, but expecting a young person to just happily trot off to a brand new school after being out of education for 3 or 4 years. That is a massive emotional risk. It's a reputational risk in some contexts. This is something that for them is overwhelmingly scary in a way that getting in a car with a stolen car with their friends would never be. Right. So hopefully that makes. I'm rushing through this because we have a modicum of time left. So in terms of working with risk, what we can do. In terms of what we can do as workers and what we can do as in supporting people to take meaningful risks that help them grow and develop, there's a lot we can learn from our Russian friend Lev Vygotsky. I'm sure a lot of you have come across his theories and frameworks in your travels. Lev Vygotsky talked about social development theory, social learning, about how people learn, how people grow, and how people develop. And the two ideas sort of central to Vygotsky's work are the zone of proximal development and the more knowledgeable other. I think my next slide, yes. So the idea of the zone of proximal development is it's that space in between things that you can easily do right now, comfort zone, people might call it, and then the things that are overwhelming that you couldn't possibly do. And a good example of this sort of zone is where I had one I heard recently was teaching a young person to do a child to do a puzzle. That to give a child a 100-piece puzzle is totally outside of their capacity to learn, their capacity to do the job. They couldn't, they wouldn't know where to start if they'd never done a puzzle before. But if you show the young person the idea of getting the edges first, you're giving them, you're sort of shifting you're supporting their learning to a learning zone that's more useful for them. So some things they can't do at all, some things they can do too easily, and where you want to be working, where you want to be pitching interventions is in that learning zone. And the more knowledgeable other is the person who knows that young person's shape, who knows where they grow, who knows what is Asking a young person to go to school after not being in education for 3 years and just catch the bus and turn up yourself, knowing that that is in the overwhelm zone for some young people, and for other young people who might have a ton of confidence and social skill, that might just be in the learning zone. So knowing your young person, having a relationship with a young person and deeply seeing all of their dimension is really important, figuring out how we provide risk. So whether it's a high ropes activity, whether it's promoting young people doing music or dance performance in front of their school, knowing where the comfort zone is, the learning zone and the anxiety zone is really important. So nothing happens in the comfort zone. It's comfortable, but nothing happens there. And I think this is, I guess, the important thing we're thinking about working with young people is where am I? Yes. Sorry, just trying to find out where I'm up to. So what we talk about, excellent. So what we talk about a lot is the idea of development of the conducive practice. So development of the conducive practice, as opposed to development of the appropriate practice, is practice that aims to provide regulated experiences, to promote learning, consequential thinking, and to try and fill some of the gaps that young people have missed. I think what's sometimes forgotten, I had a colleague recently talking about this idea of trauma-informed versus trauma-focused. There's plenty of services out there that are trauma-informed, as in they understand trauma, but there's not many services out there that are designed, their service offerings, that the way they work is designed to work with and promote sort of recovery from trauma. So there's I guess, lots of services out there that might understand adolescent development. They might have, like the stuff we've been speaking about so far, have a good idea of some of those different areas and spaces, but they're not providing activities that can help grow young people, help develop young people. And this is really important if young people are taking risks. So the idea of risk-taking is normative. Risk-taking is absolutely regular, is a totally normal thing for adolescents, as we've talked about. If we don't provide opportunities for young people to take risks in a regulated way, young people will take risks in dangerous and problematic ways. And one of the things we talk about sometimes is the idea of resource-rich versus resource-poor risk-taking, that young people left to their own devices with no resources do things like take drugs and alcohol. It's novel, it's exciting, it's dangerous. They pinch cars, they commit crimes. All those things you can do on a pretty low budget. And we sometimes have this idea that we'll just push all those risks down, we'll stop them taking these risks, we'll try and stop all the risks that are around us. And young people, you can't stop, it's like whack-a-mole. It pops up somewhere else. So what our job is to provide resources for young people to take risks in a meaningful way and in a controlled way. And with us there, the best thing about young people taking risks when we're there, whether it's high ropes or doing a rap in front of their school or wherever it might be, is that when they're taking these risks, we can use our fully developed prefrontal cortex and our experience to help them understand, and think through and develop that prefrontal cortex and improve the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. So we can help regulate and guide and develop those skills. So being part of supporting risk-taking is hugely beneficial. Some of the things that people get out of having, I guess that young people get out of risk-taking and for us promoting risk-taking is increased problem-solving skills and flexible thinking. There's some really cool things about Bush Kindy. Actually, there's one thing I want to mention just before I run out of time is this idea of a repertoire of risk. So if a young person grows up and has exposure to small incremental risk over time, over their early lifespan, what happens when they get to the really big, serious, dangerous risks that they can encounter in adolescence is they have a bunch of knowledge to draw from. So some of the stuff, like if you're 4 and you're climbing a tree, you're probably not going to get 100 meters up an oak tree, but you probably might fall out from a meter and learn about gravity and learn about friction and learn about kinetic energy. And then, over time, you understand what it's like when you crash a skateboard and you fall off and you skin your knee. So you learn about the fragility of your body and friction and all of those sort of useful things. So when it comes to being 18 and being able to drive a car, you have a whole bunch of experience and knowledge and a whole repertoire of understanding to draw on to make better decisions around risk. Unfortunately, if we rob young people of the capacity to take risk, we rob them of this repertoire to draw on. And young people take really full-on massive risks without any real chance to sort of pitch that or understand that. So the stress tolerance, another really beneficial thing that young people get out of their, sometimes when you take risks, bad things happen. Sometimes you fall over, sometimes you get hurt. Having bad things happen, having distress, it's really beneficial for young people to experience distress and realise that it's time limited. That when a bad thing happens, or you're uncomfortable or you're in distress, you feel rubbish for a little bit, but in the not too distant future, it will cease. So that lets people know that these things are transient. That pain, discomfort, stress, worry, all of these things are transient. They're not permanent states. And I guess the other idea of identity formation through skills acquisition. So if young people are just told to sit still, pay attention, behave, not go outside, not do anything dangerous, when they're 18, they've got very little opportunity to look at who they are and what they are through the things that they're good at. So going out skateboarding, you could fall over and hurt yourself, so we won't let that happen. So you don't get a chance to look at that as a part of your identity, or try sort of understand who you are through that sort of prism. It increases social functioning. People have a much greater capacity to socialise with friends. You're doing meet new people when you're taking risks. You're learning, you're creating, you're engaging with people. Typically, most risk taking is done in a social context. And I think a really important thing around risk taking is that it broadens horizons for young people. We work with a lot of kids who they will say they go to a new school and they have one thing, they have one conversation they have, which is, do you smoke bongs? I smoke bongs, we're mates now. So when young people are allowed to do things like skateboarding, like horse riding, like a variety of other risk-taking activities, when they meet new people, they've got other things to talk about. They don't have to rely on these sort of unhelpful and potentially antisocial sort of ideas. I've got like a minute left potentially.
Yeah.
All right, so just in conclusion, and I just really want to mention that this is where I'd love to continue this conversation. If this has been a little bit too fast-paced for people, or there's big bits that you'd like me to talk more about, I would love to do that in person or via email, so give me a call or email me. But in conclusion, I just wanted to mention that, to reiterate, that risk-taking is central to normal adolescent development. All mammals take risks. Risk-taking is key to learning new skills, growing and developing. So when we're talking about risk, we're talking about learning. We can't stop risk-taking. It is normative. It is inevitable. And if we do try and squash all the risk-taking we can see, we push it outside of our purview and people take dangerous, unbounded risks. Providing safe and more pro-social outside of our purview and people take dangerous, unbounded risks. Providing safe and more pro-social opportunities for risk-taking can reduce young people's problematic risk-taking behaviour. So allowing young people to take risks. And Michael Unger talks a lot about the benefit of providing young people options for responsibility. So responsibility can be a really big part of this as well. So, treating adolescents with dignity, understanding that they are capable, and giving them opportunities to take the lead and to challenge themselves through responsibility. And young people learn to make better decisions and understand risks when guided by workers. So if you can walk alongside when someone's like, I'm going to do a backflip off this roof, you're like, well, so what do we know about physics? What do you think might happen? Where do you think might land? So that part of your brain that works really well can help young people develop the part of their brain that's still being developed and integrate that with the limbic system. I think that is me. Is that
Cool.
very? I apologies for speaking quickly. That's a lot to get through.
Fantastic. So it is now question time. So if you've got questions for Geoff, could you now type them into the chat box? There's one I've already collected, so thanks to the first person who popped a question in. But now's the time because we don't have too much time left. So if you wanted to ask Geoff a question now, pop it into the chat box, and I'll actually ask Geoff the question that came through earlier, which was, does alcohol and other drugs cause violence and crime for adolescents?
Okay, so it's a really good question. I think that for young people, the idea of violence, the idea of having sort of a crime involving yourself in criminal activities, part of that is just normal risk-taking activity. Risk-taking, that crime, violence are dangerous, they're risky, they're novel, so they're going to have a draw to that, especially when you have a paucity of other experiences. You don't have a bunch of other ways to meet risk, so that can be one part of that factor. As I mentioned, the idea of essence, the emotional spark, the Dan Siegel essence of adolescent stuff, that kind of the really sort of extreme emotionality. Young people can have quite big variances in their emotional state, very emotionally sort of labile. So aggression, violence can come out of young people misreading stuff, young people still, they're not particularly good at navigating complex social arrangements. Again, all learning stuff. Young people haven't had much chance to learn in these contexts. But drugs and alcohol can absolutely exacerbate this if you're consuming drugs that disinhibit people. Alcohol, people are going to make less useful decisions. There's a lot of myths and misnomers around, and furphies around methamphetamine, that methamphetamine makes people violent. Methamphetamine makes people more threat sensitive, but it doesn't necessarily make people more violent. A lot of the stuff around adolescent risk taking is about what skills do you have to try and buffer some of the more extremes of these risks. So if you have great social skills, emotional regulation and impulse control, when that person comes up to you and says, oh, you're a dirty rat dog, I'll, whatever, then your capacity to manage that without kicking off and fighting back and getting involved in that is going to be much greater. If you add drugs and alcohol to the mix, you're usually going to be disinhibiting some of that, so some of those capacities are going to be hampered. And I guess the other part about drugs and alcohol in that space is they can really complicate that. Is it about money owed? Is it about respect owed? Is it about identity, like that kind of thing of I'm the dealer in this street, and if you owe me money, I will kick the hell out of you because this is how I get power and control, and you're a threat to that. So there's a lot of complexity, but I guess for a lot of young people, this is the important thing for violence and crime is looking at other opportunities to experience risk, to take risks and to push boundaries, but also making sure that you've got all of the skills you need to be able to manage your emotional states, to deal with distress tolerance and impulse control. And we can absolutely teach that as workers. That's the big part of our sort of role, I guess.
I think that kind of leads into another question as well. So a question that we've got from one of the participants is, what examples can you offer of what things workers can do with young people on safe risk-taking or constructive risk-taking?
So I guess not everyone has the capacity we do at YSAS. We're quite lucky. I've been quite lucky to do some, rafting, canoeing, mountain biking, adventure stuff. But I think in understanding the different dimensions of risk-taking, if you're thinking of risk-taking, novelty seeking, is that some of those risks and novel environments aren't necessarily physical risks. So as I mentioned, once had a young person who was taking a lot of, I think I mentioned this, was doing a lot of pretty sort of chaotic risk-taking stuff with a perceived benefit of, friends, peers seeing them as cool, fitting in, having that sort of peer esteem need met, and pinching cars as a way of doing that. But for this young person, the care team, we promoted the hell out of their music stuff. This young person was, they wrote raps, and we promoted the hell out of their, developing this rap, getting it all sort of written down, getting really comfortable and rehearsed with it, and then performing it in front of their alternative education setting. And for this young person, that's a huge, massive risk. It's a huge social risk. So that is novel, it's exciting, it's dangerous. You're not going to die from it, but you might feel like you're going to die from it. So you're looking at those other dimensions of risk, relational risks, emotional risks, reputational risks. And for this young person, when they did this rap in front of their school, and all their mates were like, oh man, that was the sickest, I had no idea you could do rhymes, that was mad, bro. It was the same need being met as, their mates been like, yeah, sick, we're in the stolen Commodore, you're the sickest, thanks for coming with us in the Commodore, that kind of. So understanding within your context, within the scope of your work, can you promote risk-taking where people get to put themselves, public speaking, big risk. Being vulnerable, being, whether it's group work stuff where people get to, being vulnerable and sharing stuff about themselves in front of a group context. It's incredibly scary and dangerous and risky. And I think the thing about that, back to our friend Lev Vygotsky, is knowing how to pitch any of these risks, knowing you're a young person, where they might be pretty socially savvy, so they're going to take the social risk and have to be huge to kind of be in that exciting zone. Thinking about how, what you know about a young person, what you know about their shape, where their skills and abilities are, and where their areas of sort of stretch and growth are, that, emotional risk, reputational risks, a variety of different ways of taking risk other than the physical.
Cool. All right, brilliant. We're actually going to run out of time. There's a few people who are responding. There's a couple more questions, but I might see if I can set that up so we can respond via email, and also some people are asking for resources. There's resources in your folder, and I'll take some notes about some specific resources people are asking for. I might see if we can send those out when I send out the link. Thank you so much, everybody in webinar land, for being here as well. We're going to have a feedback survey after this. If you could just stay with us, and we'd really appreciate if you could fill in that survey afterwards. I did want to, can I just have the other screen up though first? Thank you. So that's what the survey will look like. You just got a bit of a preview, so you'll have that soon. And I did just wanted to say thank you so much to Geoff for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us and to share your experience and your knowledge and all of your wisdom. That's been amazing. I've taken notes myself actually. I love this idea about having a repertoire of risk. I thought that was brilliant. So I'm going to read a bit of Dan Siegel as well. And before we go, I just wanted to let you know about the next Connect and Learn webinar. It's actually number 10, and it's with two of the clinicians from Turning Point, Dr. Vanessa Peterson, who's a clinical neuropsychologist, and Dr. Catherine Cox, a senior clinical neuropsychologist. The webinar is going to be on the 25th of October. We're going to make sure we get that out soon, so you can sign up to that on Eventbrite. So look out on the VADA e-news to be able to sign up for that. And it's called Understanding Cognition and Methamphetamine. So it's going to be really, really interesting and a lot of great information there. So please look out for that one. That one will be out there soon. But I want to say, again, thanks so much to Geoff. It's been really, really interesting. And thank you, everybody, for being live with us. And please do take a moment to fill in that survey, and we'll see you on the 25th.